Fully Coolly Progressive. Kind of an ironic title when you think about it. After all, going back and creating a sequel season to a show from the year 2000 seems like the opposite of progress, but here we are. Fully Coolly Progressive is a sequel to the original Fully Coolly series in a similar vein to Star Wars The Force Awakens, in that it reworks the series in a way while still keeping the same general motifs in place. And much like Star Wars The Force Awakens, Fully Coolly Progressive treads a lot of the same ground as the original in a really watered down, safe way. You see, the original Fully Coolly is one of my favorite anime series. It's a show about a woman named Haruko who seeks ultimate power over the galaxy. She attempts to obtain this power by hitting a middle school boy named Naota in the head with her guitar, attempting to use him as a conduit for summoning and taking control of a being named Atomisk, who is a giant bird creature with an immense power over outer space. She's initially successful as a robot comes out of Naoto's head that contains the power of Atomisk, but she makes the mistake of trying to attack Atomisk and take its power, and she breaks the robot. Then it turns out that Naota is the perfect host for Atomisk's power, so Haruko moves in with him as a housekeeper and attempts to manipulate him to do her bidding and eventually give her Atomisk's power. She tries to do this by making romantic advances towards him, and initially Naota is confused and thinks she is actually romantically interested in him. Atomisk is actually being held captive in a giant iron by an organization called Medical Mechanica, and Naota is the only person who can access his power through a portal in his head, and eventually he ends up freeing Atomisk and setting him off in the galaxy, neither to be held captive by Medical Mechanica or Haruko. Naota eventually comes to this decision after confessing his love for Haruko, which releases Atomisk from the NO portal in his head, and Haruko sets off again. Now there's a couple key elements to this story that are important to understand, and those two things are Haruko's actual motivations throughout the story, as well as Naoto's character arc. Throughout the show, there's sort of a false assumption made by Commander Amuro, who is the head of the Department of Interstellar Immigration. He has contacts with Medical Mechanica, which is the organization that keeps Atomisk at bay and thinks it's best if Haruko's plans are stopped. But he has a very basic view of the situation going around him as he tries to stop Haruko from awakening Atomisk. He assumes that Haruko is after Atomisk because she wants to be his lover, and he also assumes that Atomisk is some sort of male figure. He's wrong in this, obviously, as everything presented in Haruko's character goes against this. She's a power-hungry, maniacal criminal who just seeks power. To have Haruko be after Atomisk just to have some kind of a love affair would completely undermine this aspect of her character. Now this is important because it's going to come up again in Fully Coolly Progressive, but we'll get to that. The other key element to understand is Naota's character arc throughout Fully Coolly. Naota is a middle schooler who feels lost because all of the adults in his life are what he perceives as emotionally immature, and he feels like he has no one guiding him in a sense. Because of this, he attempts to put up a sort of front and act in a way that he perceives as being mature, while not realizing that he's being untrue to himself. He eventually just decides to be who he is inside because maturity comes with experience, and he doesn't have as much experience as those adults around him. And those adults themselves are just doing their best to figure out life and survive, though they make a ton of mistakes along the way. Him realizing this is what makes him just go for his feelings and confess his boyish, naive love to Haruko. Naota's arc is interesting and nuanced, and the show focuses on him primarily and what he goes through. And this is what makes Fully Coolly interesting. This is another important point to make, because it's going to come up again later in Fully Coolly Progressive. Speaking of which, Fully Coolly Progressive takes place years after the original, in a more modern day setting where we have smartphones. Fully Coolly Progressive follows a new main protagonist this time, named Hidomi Habajiri. She's a 14-year-old girl who rarely speaks, and is fairly gloomy, especially to her energetic mother. One day, while going to school, she gets ran over by a white-haired woman named Julia Jinyu. Julia Jinyu seemingly does this in an attempt to kill or suppress Hidomi. This is because Julie is aware that Haruko is trying to get close to Hidomi and manipulate her into releasing Atomisk again. As it turns out, Haruko is Hidomi's teacher, and there's another important character in her class named Ide. Ide has a crush on Hidomi, and Haruko knows this, so she tries to get them together and then manipulate their relationship in order to get Hidomi to release Atomisk out of her head. Now, the reason for Haruko wanting to free Atomisk this season is what sort of kills her character for me. You see, in the original Fully Coolly, Haruko's motivation for wanting to free Atomisk was purely selfish. She wanted to control his power. This season though, Haruko's reasoning for wanting to set Atomisk free is portrayed more like some sort of love story, and the reason this bothers me is because that's exactly what the original Fully Coolly sort of made fun of with the character Commander Amuro. As I said before, his assumption was that Haruko's whole reason for wanting to awaken Atomisk stemmed from romantic feelings she had for him. This wasn't true though in the original series, but in this one it is. And it feels like this decision to change her character was made just to give the character of Julia something to do in the plot. You see, Julia is actually an individual who spawned from Haruko and has her DNA. Her whole goal is to free Adamisk as well, but not for her own personal reasons. Julia wants to free him and let him go on his own so no one can have his power, and no one can control the universe. Julia is one of the weakest parts of the entire show for me by far. She just feels like a less interesting opposition to Haruko in the narrative. She moves in as a housemaid into Hidomi's home, just like Haruko did for Naota, except this time Julia's goal is to protect instead of to manipulate, like Haruko was trying to do with Naota. Her character is only interesting because the original character of Haruko exists, and she doesn't stand on her own very well. Her personality isn't well developed, and her role in the story just doesn't feel compelling, because she's not given enough time on screen. More time is focused on Haruko and her story. I almost feel like she should have had a larger focus in the narrative, and Haruko just shouldn't have been in this story. Haruko's arc just ruins her character anyways for me, and it takes up more time for developing Julia as a character. Julia's role as a character is just one example of how everything in Fully Coolly Progressive feels like a watered down version of the original. Another example is Hidomi's character arc. Hidomi's main story is that she's sad that her father left her and her mother to run the family cafe by themselves. This is what causes her to be sort of gloomy and distant in the narrative. But by the end of the story, her mother tells her that they can run the cafe on their own and that she doesn't need to keep being sad about her father. She also falls in love with Ide. Ide and Hidomi's relationship is one of the main focuses of the show as well, and it honestly just feels like one of the most bland romance stories ever. There's not much to talk about with it. Ide kind of just falls in love with Hidomi instantly, and she kind of just goes along with it. It just feels so rushed and awkward, and I really didn't understand why it was included in the first place. This whole character arc is way less interesting than Naota's in the original Fully Coolly. You see, the original Fully Coolly is way more focused as a story. Everything in the plot serves to tell the story of Naota's growth as an individual. The conflict between Medical Mechanica and Haruko over Adamisk ultimately doesn't really matter when you get down to the central themes presented in the story. But since most of the story is told through Naota's eyes and revolves around him, the story has meaning and purpose. Everything about Medical Mechanica and Haruko serves to tell Naota's story, but in Fully Coolly Progressive, Hidomi's character arc feels almost secondary to finding out what happened to Haruko and finding out what happened to Medical Mechanica from the first series. The show uses all these motifs from the original to sort of dangle a carrot in front of the audience to get them to watch. It's using the success of the original to market itself and is banking off of that success. I feel like they should have either done something original and extremely compelling with the original source material, or just create a new IP entirely. I'd just rather see something new. Hopefully Fully Coolly Alternative can turn out to be a better experience though. But hey, until then, why don't you subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed this video, and leave a like if you enjoyed it as well. I'll see you in the next one.